Hello. We're going to be in Joshua 13 through 15 today. It seems like a lot to cover, but basically it's just geographical material that's very hard for us to grasp unless we look at a map. And there's such wonderful maps available today, and we think they're 90% accurate. We're not sure on many of these locations. Now Joshua divides into two separate halves. Chapters 1 through 12 are the conquest of the Promised Land, and then 13 through 19 is the division of the Promised Land among the tribes. So let's look at it if we could. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years. We learned from chapter 14, verse 10, that Caleb was about 85, and I'm assuming Joshua is somewhere in that area. Now we know that the longevity of people is getting shorter. Moses lived to 120, but Joshua here is considered an older man, around 85. Okay? And when the Lord said to him, "You are old and advanced in years, and very much of the land remains to be possessed." Now in the next few verses, we're going to describe what parts of the land were not possessed. Now this seems to be somewhat contradictory from chapters 1 through 12, because it seems to imply that Joshua totally defeated all the Canaanite armies. But what Joshua did was defeat the main military strongholds, these city-states, these large city-states. We learned from Judges chapter 1, a parallel to this, a summary of the conquest, and archaeology, as well as this verse right here in chapter 13, that the tribes had to take their own allocations. They had to possess their own inheritance, and many of them never really fulfilled that. Notice, if you would, where it says, and this is the land that remains, all the regions. Now, let me just give you a real summary quickly. Verses 2 through 3 is the unconquered land in the south. Verses 4 through 6 is the unconquered land in the north. And verses 8 through 14, it refers back to the eastern side of the Jordan, where all of that land apparently had not been conquered either. The region of the Philistines. Now, the Philistines, the nation Palestine gets its name from Philistines. They are the only uncircumcised group in this area. They seem to be from the Aegean Islands. They were a mercenary group. They had iron implements before the other peoples did, which made them so much more powerful than them. They seemed to try to invade Egypt around the 12th century BC and were repulsed. And they settled on the southern coast of Palestine on 5 major strongholds. And we see those strongholds listed in verse 3. And you can see them clearly on a map. And I hope you'll turn to the back of your Bible, or if you have a set of maps. By the way, this would be a good point for me to do this. In these kind of geographical sections where it talks about cities and valleys and mountains, you need a good book. This book is The Biblical Backgrounds by Callaway, put out by Broadman Press. It'll be very helpful in this kind of area. And one that I use quite often and really like is the Wycliffe Historical Geography of the Bible Lands, put out by Moody, written by Voss. Both of these kinds of books are going to be very helpful as we look at these different lands. There's a wonderful new map out from Moody Press. We're still uncertain about many of the sites archaeologically, but it's true enough for you to see kind of the general era of the tribal allocations. Now notice, if you would then, where it mentions the Gershites. Now, the Gershites are mentioned back in chapter 12, verse 5. But unfortunately, this is a different group of Gershites. The Gershites mentioned in chapter 12, verse 5 will be mentioned in verse 13 of chapter 13, but this is a different group. The same tribe, but probably lived in 2 different areas is why it's like this. Notice in verse 3 where it says, from the Shihor. Now this means, originally the etymology is black, and many think it refers to the Nile, for that's how the designation in Isaiah 23:3 for the Nile. But this probably refers to it's called the Brook of Egypt on most maps. You can't see it on this map I'm going to use today because it's a little bit down farther south. But it is it's called the Wadi El Arish, and most of us think it's the southern boundary of the Promised Land, not the Nile, because that would involve the children of Israel from fighting with the Egyptians. Notice it mentions then the 5 lords of the Philistines. The Philistines are mentioned in Genesis chapter 10, verse 14, and there was probably some of them in this area long before the major body of them came. And here are the 5 ones: Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon. Now my Bible has Gittite, but the King James has Gath, and that's probably what it refers to as Gath. And Ekron, and these are the 5 major cities, and they're right along the southern coast of Palestine. Now notice, if you would, where it calls the Avite. No one knows who these people are or what their name means. They are mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 23, around the area of Gaza. Some commentators surmise that this may have been the kind of Canaanites that lived here before they were dispossessed by the Philistines, and that's as good a guess as any. To the south, the land of the Canaan. Now here we have another word that means cave. Now I want to give you some of the names through here, but I must admit to you, these names are very uncertain. If you look up in one concordance, it'll say one thing. You look up in one commentary, it'll say another thing. That just shows we don't really know what all these names really mean. Now, it mentions the Sidonians in verse 4, and of course, this shows the ancientness of this account, for Tyre becomes the major city in a later date. Now, Sidon is on the seacoast just north of the Promised Land, and it's the nationality that we would call the Phoenicians, the sea people, Tyre and Sidon. And here it mentions Sidon. In verse 5, we have the Gabalite. Now, we know that later on is the city of Byblos, and it's mentioned a couple of times in the Bible, 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 18, and Ezekiel chapter 27, 9. Okay? And now it says, mentioned in verse 5, also from Baal Gad. Now, Baal is the name for the male fertility god of the Canaanite pantheon. His name in Hebrew means owner or master or lord or husband. I think one of the best little books on the Canaanite pantheon is this Archaeology and the Religion of Israel by William Foxwell Albright, beginning on page 82. Now, from some of our finds archaeologically, we know that Baal had a sister called Ashtaroth or Astarte, and she's mentioned in verse 12. We're not sure how his sister became his consort, but that seems to be who she is. Baal was worshipped by an uplifted stone and an altar, and Ashtaroth was worshipped by either a carved wooden piece or a live tree. King James often translates this word, the groves, but it probably should be a tree and not several trees. Notice, if you would then, and by the way, there's a Baal in every town. Verse 6, all the inhabitants of the hill country from Lebanon as far as, and here's another Hebrew word that means hot springs or burning waters. We're not exactly sure where it is, but God says, I'm going to drive them out. God's going to do it, but they're going to have to get prepared for war. Now notice it mentions in verse 8, again verse 7 and 8, these tribes on the eastern bank. Reuben, we think, means behold a son. You can almost see that as Jacob is strolling back and forth, and of course, Leah's first baby was a boy. You can hear the midwife shout, it's a son, and they named him that, Reuben. Ben means son. And then we have Gad also mentioned here. In verse 4 is the little city Ar, and it is on the southern boundary between the tribal allocation of Reuben. It's very close to the Arnon River, which is the boundary between Moab and the allocation of Reuben. Og's mentioned in verse 12. Remember Og back in Numbers 21, verses 33 through 35? He's the one that had the giant bed, right? Remember the Hebrews were so impressed. He had this big brass bed. They kept it for years and years. And also in verse 12, we have the term Ashtaroth or Astarte. It's the love goddess, sometimes called Venus, sometimes Diana in other cultures, but here it's Astarte. Now notice the Rephidim is mentioned here in verse 12. Now, the Rephidim is a name that can mean three different things in the Bible. From Job chapter 26, verse 5, we know it means the realm of the dead, the shades, the dead ones. But it also can mean a tribal group, we learned from the book of Genesis, and also it could mean the giants. Now, the Anakim, mentioned over here in chapter 14, verse 12 through 15, which we think means long-necked, the Rephidim and the Anakim seem to be two different names for these giants. My personal theology says that it goes back to Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God, the angels, married the daughters of men, and the giants came from that. I think that's what that means, although it could be the line of Cain and the line of Seth. Notice in verse 14, it mentions the tribe of Levi did not receive an inheritance. That's because they're going to receive their sustenance from the tithes of the people locally, and the Levites that are the priests will receive theirs from the altar. And so here we have a mention of that, and you might want to see Deuteronomy 18, 1 and following for a further discussion of that. It mentions the God of Israel here. This is probably a good place for us to mention that we don't know what the word Israel means. Isn't that surprising? From Genesis 32:28, where Jacob is first called Israel as he wrestled with the angel all night, it seems to mean one who contends with God. But many other sources say it refers to one who is right with God. We just don't know what Israel means, as many of these words are like that. We have the tribal allocation of Reuben from verses 15 down through 23. A couple of points I'll make. Here in verse 17, we have two more mentions of names that have this male fertility god. Bamoth Baal, which we think means the high place of Baal. And of course, Baal worship was done on these high heels. I guess they thought they were closer to God. We learn from not only the book of Hosea, but also the book of Jeremiah, that Israel got so caught up in this later that under every green tree and every high hill, they played the harlot with this god. And so this high place of Baal, you see where they were worshipped. Now, Beth Baal Meon, we learn from the Septuagint, probably means the house of Baal. Beth, of course, Bethlehem, Bethsaida, house of, and this is house of Baal. And there was a Baal in every general locality. Now, in verse 20, we have a name for a mountain. It's called Pisgah. This is always seemingly connected with Nebo, and the place that I guess it's most clear is Deuteronomy 34:1. It's kind of like Sinai and Horeb, two different names for the same mountain. Sinai is a non-Hebrew name that seems to be related to the wilderness of Sin, S-I-N. We think that maybe either Pisgah is the peak or Nebo is the peak, and the other is the range of mountains, but again, we're just not sure of that. Notice then in verse 22, it mentions the sons of Israel who also killed Balaam, the son of Peor, the diviner, with the sword among the rest of their slain. Now this goes back to the count in Numbers 22 through 25. This is a guy whose donkey talked to him. The donkey saw the angel of the Lord, and it's a very interesting account. He was a true prophet apparently, but a non-Hebrew, and he was forced to bless Israel instead of curse her, but he did give the king Balak information about the sexual perversion tendencies of the people of God and caused the people the sin of Baal of Peor. And you can look that up in Numbers, of course. Now Gad is mentioned in verses 24 down through 28. The only thing I really want to pick up here, again, as you look at a map of the division of the tribes of Canaan, you can see each one of these so well that it's not really necessary for me to go over these. We're not exactly sure, but these maps are pretty accurate. You can get a general idea of what they're talking about. I do want to mention in verse 27 the Sea of Chinnereth. Now this sea goes by several different names. You know it by the very popular name, the Sea of Galilee. It's also called in Roman times the Sea of Tiberias because of the Roman city of Tiberias that's located on its shore. It also goes by Lake Gennesaret, and here it's called the Sea of Chinnereth, all those different names. We have Manasseh beginning in verse 29 and going over to verse 31. We have a couple of sons here mentioned. There's a son Jair in verse 30. It's kind of surprising. It seems when you look at his father's side, he's of the tribe of Judah, but when you look on his mother's side, he's of the tribe of Manasseh. And that's unusual. He'd be listed from his mother's lineage. Then in verse 31 is another son's, and this son is Manasseh's oldest son, who is apparently already born. You might want to see Genesis 50, verse 23 for Machir. Now, beginning in chapter 14, we have Eleazar the priest. Now, of course, he's the son of Aaron, the high priest during Joshua's very difficult time of the conquest and the dividing of the promised land. Notice they're going to get the heads of the tribes together, and by lot, they're going to show who's who. Now, we don't know exactly what the lot is. The lot's mentioned quite often. Numbers 26, verse 55 and 56, Numbers 33, verse 54, and Numbers 34, verse 13. It's also mentioned twice in the New Testament. Once where the Roman soldiers cast lots for Jesus' robe, Matthew 27:35, which is an allusion to Psalms 22:18, and also where they cast lots to replace Judas with Mattathias, which is Acts 1:26. Some think it's somehow related to the Urim and the Thummim of the high priest who kept it in a little pouch behind the breastplate. But if that's true, it couldn't have been used in the New Testament, I don't think, because that is lost. Some think it's a set of dice. Some think it's like a black rock and a white rock. The rabbis say that it was two jars. In one jar was the different tribal allocations, and the other was the name of the tribes, and they drew one and drew the other. But to tell you the truth, I think it's just speculation, and we really don't know what this lot is. But I would say to you, this is not to say that Christians ought to use Ouija boards or cast Scrabble things to find the will of God. That is not what this is trying to teach us here. It records what they did, but it doesn't advocate it as a way to know the will of God. Just like the Gideon's fleece, though recorded, is not advocated for us to do that. That's an act of unbelief on Gideon's part in Judges, not faith. Notice, if you would, then in verse 6, we have one of several accounts of the tribal allocation of Judah. And the reason it's so repeated and so very specific is because Judah is going to be the line of the Messiah. And although Jerusalem is not in the tribal allocation of Judah, it's really in the tribal allocation of Benjamin, but it's right on the border, and it's often identified with Judah. It's why this repeated so much. And right here, while I'm on it, I want to say to you that if you look at the map, you'll notice that Simeon is kind of the same color as Judah. Very early in the history of the tribes, Simeon and Judah are kind of amalgamated into one tribe, and Simeon pretty much loses his identity. Now notice it went to Gilgal, which means circle, the first campsite inside the Promised Land. And here we have Caleb. Now Caleb originally means dog. I don't know why his mother was mad at him, but she called him dog, and that's not a real popular word. It wasn't a little poodle idea. You might want to see Deuteronomy 1, 35 and 36. Now he's called here a Kenizzite. Now a Kenizzite is listed as one of the clans of Esau in Genesis 15:19 and Genesis 36:11. You mean that he was not a Hebrew? Well, that apparently is the truth, and it's hard for us to understand how he came identified with the tribal allocation of Judah. But several times in the Pentateuch, he's mentioned as being within Judah. Matter of fact, he is the representative of Judah among the 12 tribes. You might want to see Numbers 13:6, Numbers 14:24, Numbers 34:19, and Deuteronomy 1, 35 and 36, where Caleb is identified with Judah. Notice it mentions Moses here. The word of the Lord spoke to Moses, the man of God. Now this is another title for Moses a little bit further down, where he's called the servant of the Lord in verse 7. The man of God is a prophetic kind of title, and the servant of the Lord in verse 7 is an honorific kind of title. Joshua is not called the servant of the Lord until after his death in chapter 24. David is called a servant of the Lord. Many of us believe that Paul's favorite phrase, a slave of Christ or slave of the Lord, comes from this honorific title in the Old Testament. It is also probably the source of the servant songs of Isaiah beginning in chapter 40 through 66, where the first few songs are obviously of the whole nation. By the time we come to the redemptive servant song of Isaiah 53, it comes to the ideal Israelite, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Now notice, if you will, where it mentions Kadesh Barnea here in verse 6. Now the Hebrew word for holy is kadosh. So Kadesh is obviously a play on that, but no one knows what Barnea means. It's an oasis that is just south of the Dead Sea, about halfway between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Ocean. It was a site, a major campsite during the 38-year wilderness wandering period. Notice where it mentions then, in verse 7, he goes back and tells about how his heart was fully given to the Lord and how he followed God fully. It's going back to his time as one of the 2 spies that gave a good report as Moses sent the spies into the Promised Land. And you remember the account in the book of Numbers, what a disaster that was. But Joshua and Caleb were the only 2 that were allowed to enter the Promised Land who were older 20 years old. The rest had to die in the wilderness. Now notice it says in verse 9, so Moses swore on that day. Now you might want that place where his foot dwelt, he would inherit that. You might want to see Numbers 14:24 and Deuteronomy 1:36 for the allusion to that. In verse 10, he mentions his age at 85 years old. He seems that he was about 40 years old when he was the representative for Judah in Numbers to spy out the land. They wandered 38 years in the wilderness wandering period, and apparently the conquest up to this point had taken 7 years. So he's about 85 years old. But notice he says that his strength was as strong as it had ever been in verse 11. Now this going out and coming in seems to refer to the normal activities of life. This same thing is said of Moses in Deuteronomy 34:7 when he was 120 years old. God was able to keep the vitality of their lives as they served him in this very special way, both Caleb, Joshua, and to some extent, completely Moses. Now notice it mentions in verse 12, we have an account of the Anakim. And again, you might want to see Numbers 13:33. It's the giants. They're called the long neckers, and they live in these fortified cities. Remember Numbers 13:28. Now the Hebrews are living in tents, and there were these big cities that were afraid of them. Now the next little phrase says, perhaps the Lord, let me turn my page here, will be with me. Now that seems a little doubtful. Perhaps the Lord will be with me. And some have said maybe this is Caleb showing a little reservation. But no, that's not true. This is a Hebrew idiom of faith, and it just sounds kind of tentative or doubtful in an English translation, but really it's not. Notice in verse 13 we have Hebron was given to Caleb. Now Hebron was the place where the giants lived. Here this 85-year-old man asked Joshua, said, give me the city where the giants live. I'll take those big suckers. What a great man of faith, 85 years old, and he wants the most difficult place. He wants to take the giants. I've heard many times when the older people get together, this is a devotional they use. Now, Hebron is a city, of course, about halfway down the Dead Sea, a little bit toward the Mediterranean. We also know from chapter 21, verse 11, that it's a Levitical city. Now, there are 48 Levitical cities, and 6 of them are cities of refuge that are discussed in chapter 20 and 21 of Joshua. The reason I bring that up is even though these are Levitical cities, it doesn't mean that only Levites lived in them, for here Caleb obviously lives in the city along with Levites. And in Joshua 20, it says that the men who flee to these kind of cities have to talk to the elders, and if they were all Levites, they wouldn't be called elders. So I think that these cities had mixed populations there. Notice it mentioned in verse 14, until this day. Throughout the book of Joshua, I forgot how many times, but well over a dozen times, this unto this day is used, which shows that somebody is writing later than Joshua's day. Whether it's immediately after Joshua's day, which is rabbinical tradition, it's Eleazar records Joshua's death, and then Eleazar's son records his death, I'm not sure. The Jews have 2 major people they talk about editing the entire Old Testament. One of them is the prophet Jeremiah, and one of them is the scribe Ezra. I'm not real sure who edited this. It is my faith presupposition that the Bible is the Word of God and that the editor is inspired as the original author. But I do believe in the historicity of the Old Testament, even when we do have these obvious allusions to a later editor. Notice the city in verse 15, Kiriath Arba. This is also called the city of Mamre in the book of Genesis. Genesis 13:18, Genesis 23:2 and following, Genesis 35:27. This is where Abraham is going to buy a cave to bury his family in. Okay? Now this Kiriath means a city of 4, we think. Some think it's talking about a confederation of cities. Others think it refers to the phases of the moon and therefore moon worship. We're just not sure. See, by the way, the word Arab there is the name of the father of Anak, which of course is the giants. You might want to see Joshua 15:13 and Joshua 21:11. Now chapter 15. And now the law of the tribe of the sons of Judah. And of course a lot more time is spent here because it's the line of the Messiah. The city of Jerusalem is going to be understood to be in its area, and it takes a lot more time. We think the word Judah means praised. According to their families, reached the border of Edom. Now, of course, on the eastern side of the river were these 3 relatives. Edom, of course, came from Esau. They're below the Dead Sea. Right next to the Dead Sea, on the eastern side, is Moab, and right north by the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River is Ammon. They are the 2 relatives of Lot by the incestuous relationship with his daughters. And you might remember that account. Westward toward the wilderness of Zin, Z-I-N. We need to remember the wilderness of Sinai is down toward the southern part of the Sinai desert where we think Mount Sinai is. But the wilderness of Zin, Z-I-N, is to the north. It's the southernmost boundary of Judah. We would call it the Negev, or the uninhabited desert region, close to Kadesh Barnea. In verse 3, we have the descent of the Acharim, and that means the scorpions. You know this was a tough place, don't you? Woo, I tell you what. Notice in verse 6 something very interesting. The stone of Boham, the son of Reuben. Now we know nothing of this Boham, which means thumb. And why was a stone raised up for him as a memorial? We have no earthly idea. Just one of those things that aren't recorded. Notice there's 2 springs mentioned in verse 7 that seem to be on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem. And you might want to see that. Now in verse 8 we have the valley of Ben Hinnom. This is right below the city of Jerusalem where the Kidron Valley and the Tyro-Phoenician Valley come together. It's where the god Molech, the fire god, where children were sacrificed to, was worshipped. The Jews hated this, and they turned it into a garbage dump for Jerusalem. This is the word that Jesus uses to describe hell. Gehenna, Ge, valley, Hinnom, the sons of Hinnom. And that's where he gets his metaphors of the fire never going out, the worm never dying, the stench, the horror of that thing. And of course it doesn't touch the hem of the garment of the reality of it, but it is Jesus' word for hell, and it comes from this valley, the sons of Hinnom. I have a tape on the different words for the afterlife, Hades, Gehenna, Sheol, Tartarus. I hope you'll send for that tape. It may open your eyes to those kinds of things. Now notice in verse 9 we have Baalah, which we think probably is the female form of Baal, maybe mistress, and we have Kirioth. Now this is the place that we think that Judas Iscariot may come from, this town Kirioth, but we're just not sure. It could also refer to an assassin's knife, and we're not certain. If he did live here, he's the only Judean in the apostolic group of our Lord. Notice in verse 10 it mentions Mount Seir, which means rough or shaggy, but there are many Mount Seirs in the Bible area. It was a very popular name like Watchtower, and so there are many by this same name. Notice we have Beth Shemesh in verse 10, means house of the sun. We refer to sun worship, was obvious, along with Canaanite fertility worship. And then Timnah is mentioned in verse 10. That'll be a very important site in the life of Samuel in the book of Judges that'll coming up. The Great Sea is mentioned in verse 12, and of course that is the Mediterranean Ocean. Now beginning the rest of this chapter is very geographical, and I'm not going to go through it really. Verses 13 through 19 describe the fall of Hebron to Caleb. Verses 33 through 36 are the northeastern coastal area. Verses 37 through 41 is the middle coastal area. We call it the Sheplah coastal plain. Verses 42 through 44 is the southern coastal area where the Philistines would live. And then 45 through 47 is the Philistine coast itself. And that kind of deals with this. Now, I want to go to 63 real quick, where it mentions the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the sons of Judah, could not drive them out. Apparently, Joshua captured the lower city, but not the fortress on the hill. It wasn't until the time of David that this Jebusite fortress was captured by David by damming up a spring and going under the wall. And that's when it became the fortress of David, or the city of Jerusalem, was complete. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you. I hope you'll get a geography book and look at this book on the Canaanite fertility pantheon. Get you a map. You're going to need it in this section. I've enjoyed being with you. God bless you. I'll see you again. Same time, same place next week.